All right, so I just want to kick it off by welcoming everyone this evening to our special adult education program with Rabbi Unger. It's wonderful to see you. I want to thank Rabbi Kurtz for making the introduction. We always like when you bring into our orbit of a good at Shalom new voices, new opportunities to learn. And I think we've all found that through the virtual world in which we're living, and hopefully it'll be a little more in person, that we have found many ways to learn from each other. So Rabbi Unger, I want to thank you for your time and everyone for coming this evening. And I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Kurtz, who will really host the program this evening. So Rabbi Kurtz.
Thank you, Rabbi Cohen, and thank you to our president, Toby Schaefer, as well. It's a pleasure to have Rabbi Dr. Abraham Unger Shlita with us this evening. So Rabbi Unger and I, we go back a good number of years. When I was a student at YU, we had a program called Hisori. It sent students to smaller shuls for Shabbosim. It's a little bit like Torah tours, but it was more consistent. So Rabbi Unger was one of the rabbis of the shuls that we went to, and we've really kept a connection going on throughout the years. So it's good to reconnect. And I just want to share, I really try to find figures who emulate the values we have of Torah Umada, people who are very knowledgeable in traditional Talmudic biblical knowledge, but also at the same time are very rooted in academia and understand the world around us. So Rabbi Unger is one of these individuals that he not only has a very traditional yeshiva background education, but also he's very much steeped in academia as well. As the director of urban programs at Wagner, as well as a professor there. And also, I believe you mentioned you serve as a rabbi, as the campus chaplain there too in that capacity. Also, it was very beautiful. I was looking through all of your accomplishments. Something that stuck out to me as well is that Rabbi Unger is a senior fellow for research at the Orthodox Union, and also has authored a number of works such as A Jewish Public Theology, which I understand we're going to hear a little bit about this evening. So what I think is very interesting for us that we're thinking about over these past years and these past days is we see so many questions coming up in the world of contemporary issues. And the question is, how does the Torah approach all these multitude of questions? And this evening, Rabbi Unger is going to address how Judaism approaches, and in some ways doesn't approach, economic and urban policy. And instead of me elaborating on it, Rabbi Unger, you now have the floor.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Cohen and Rabbi Kurtz and Congregation Negulah Shalom for hosting me. It's really a pleasure to be with you this evening. I try to treat all my talks, as it were, as seminars. So please feel free as I go along to ask a question. If I feel the need to make a point, I may hold off on taking the question immediately, but I will get to everyone. And if I can take the break, I will take the question as it comes. So no holds barred in terms of asking the question. The one thing I ask, which is what I ask of my students at Wagner College, where I am a poli-sci professor, is because we're going to be touching on sensitive issues, and I know we're a wise olam, a wise crowd, as it were, nonetheless, to be civil always and respectful, because we're living in sensitive times. And we're about to approach some very sensitive topics, perhaps the most sensitive of all. And I'll explain why I give my Hakdama introduction in that way in just a minute. And I'm going to start with two basic hypotheses. And they are, the first one is the point from which I start my work every single day as a researcher and as a speaker on American government and American politics, as well as on the American Jewish community. That's the work I do for the OU in terms of work on demographics and social change in the American Jewish community for programmatic purposes for the OU. What I'm going to say is that Judaism is a grand enough and big enough and rich enough tradition to speak to any issue out there that we might find in the universe, as it were, and certainly in our universe of life, of daily life. It is not just a narrow area of ritual. It is not just a culture. It is not just, quote unquote, a religion, small r, but it is in fact a broad, large umbrella, and it can address every single aspect of our lives, whether we talk about tax policy, whether we talk about the politics of identity, and all those hot controversial issues of today, whether we talk about student life on campus, or whether we talk about social responsibility of corporations or immigration, Judaism is big enough and it can address anything in that field. It is not a small, narrow field. It is a broad umbrella for human thought. That's the first hypothesis. Judaism is a big tent, and let's not underestimate its impact on our life. I know I'm speaking to a crowd committed to Torah and under great rabbinic leadership, but it's worth remembering that piece of how grand and big Judaism is. The second part, the second hypothesis I'm working from today, which extends the first one, is that Judaism, because it comes from antiquity, because it is theologically driven, because it is from Sinai, it is God-given, it gives us a kind of discourse that can enrich and perhaps bring us past the conflicts we might find in our quote-unquote secular lives today. I say quote-unquote around the word secular because Judaism doesn't recognize secular and religious. Just a metaphor from the tradition homiletically is we have chulin and kodshim, right? We have holy meat and secular meat, but it's all religious. It all has to be slaughtered and handled a certain way. That's, you know, it's a bit of homiletics right there, but I think the metaphor rings true. And just we had a few weeks ago in Parshas Mishpatim, didn't we have, you know, the court has to be located right near the Mizbeach. There's a point there being made. And so Judaism can speak to every aspect of our lives today, no matter how difficult in our daily quote unquote secular lives. And because it's from before the current controversies, and because it's from a faith tradition, might actually get us past the current controversies. So those are my two correlate hypotheses. Judaism is big, and Judaism can get us past controversies of today because it is ahistorical. It's beyond history, and it's all encompassing. Now, what we're going to do tonight, literally in the next 50 or so minutes, is solve the biggest problem in America. That's what we're going to do. That's a small task that I've carved out for us this evening in our source sheet that Rabbi Kurtz has been kind enough to put up when and if I ask him. We're not ready there for it yet, but when it happens. So that's all we're going to do tonight, is solve the biggest problem in America. One thing that capitalism and communism agree on, that Marx and Adam Smith agreed on, is that economics is the issue that drives human society, that drives human behavior. It comes down to economics, no matter where one stands on regulation or taxation, no matter what one's position is, left, right, or somewhere in the center. I like to think I'm a centrist. Nonetheless, it's about economics. And we do find there's a lot of proof of that, right? I mean, great social tensions emerge when there are economic frustrations in the population. And I think we're living through a period of that. In political science and urban policy, which is what I actually do for a living, I research that and talk about it and write about it, consult on it. Urban policy, the loss of the American middle class. By that, we really mean the non-college educated middle class. Only about 35 to 38% of Americans finish college. The non-college educated manufacturing blue-collar middle class, the loss of stability in that population, and economic cleavages and terms you might have heard like the income gap, all those frustrations which are now playing themselves out in our national politics, that's the issue of the day, undergirding, I would say, almost everything, economic frustration. There's a concern among the affluent because, you know, people have worked their way up and, you know, they have resources, and why should they be, you know, treated in a certain way for that, and why should there be resentment towards that? And there's a concern among the non-affluent because they're feeling besieged by the local economy. So we have, you know, with the loss of the middle class, there's no buffer between rich and poor, as it were. It's a huge literature, the loss of the middle class. We're going to solve that problem tonight. Deindustrialization, the income gap, the loss of the middle class. We're not going to do it with a specific policy prescription, but we are going to do it with a new kind of discourse to get us past the partisanship of today. I promised Rabbi Kurtz I would get us past the partisanship of today. So I'm going to, we have Gemira Stas, we have some kind of pledge we made with each other. I have to keep my promise. So you're going to walk away with a bunch of sources that I think can create a new way of speaking and thinking about the economic issue tearing at the fabric of American democracy. And we're going to do this because, to tie to one of my first hypotheses, Judaism has something to say. It has what to say about where we are today, and it has what to say about any point at which we find ourselves in history. So let's begin with the source sheet. Rabbi Kurtz, would you mind just putting it up for a second? Much of what I'm saying is from some recent research I've just put out. So I've sort of worked this through over time, you know, in a book, and you know, it's sort of come together organically. And there's been some you know, good response to the book across faith communities, by the way, not only in the Jewish community. So I'm hoping that this is resonant with this community as well, and that you find some new language with which to approach public policy, and with which to approach the searing issues tearing at American democracy today because of economics, because of differences on issues like regulation, on issues like the income gap, and on issues that are really searing and quite visible and played out in voting patterns, quite frankly. So here's the theoretical framework. I like to start with a model always. I had a professor once in graduate school. I went to Fordham, good Jesuit institution for an Orthodox Jewish boy. And I had a professor, and I raised my hand once. I was critiquing something in the syllabus, and he said, Unger, he banged on the table like a Rosh Hashiva. Unger, he said, argue from within the model. Your critique is valid, but you're not arguing from within the model. So I always like to set up a model, a framework, as it were, within which to then place our sources and to come to some kind of clarity of conclusion. By way of introduction as well, I didn't pick these sources because they are so different from each other. There is, within the piece of the Gemara that I've chosen 4 excerpts from, there are differences, and that's played out, and I'll reference how that got played out a little bit as we go through them, if we get to all of them tonight. If not, you have the sheet from Rabbi Kurtz, who can forward it to you anyway, depending on how far we get. My goal is actually to narrow the scope of difference. The methodology I take from Jewish learning is that rather than just expand difference, I like to sort of resolve machlokus if possible. We could live with a taker, we could live with unresolved questions, but I'd rather not. I'd rather narrow the scope of difference. That's a Jewish value from learning. So I like to ask people if they don't mind reading, because when you say it out loud, it makes it come alive. Who would like to read the first paragraph? It makes it more real if we can. If not, I'll read it. I'll volunteer myself if no one wants to.
Okay, I'll do it.
Thank you for the president of the shul. Thank you.
That leadership, Okay, so theoretical framework.
Yes, yes.
Judaism offers a wholly other way to organize society. Its overriding principle of governance is based on the ultimate value of human dignity within a local community of networked citizens as the engine of public policy, rather than prioritizing an economic perspective within the context of a broader impersonal state, as both capitalists and Marxists do. Halakha prescribes letting economic considerations drive governmental decision-making. Jewish law reminds its students at every turn that the self-worth of the individual made in God's image, as Genesis recounts, is the final metric underpinning any attempt at sewing the fabric of a good society.
We can stop there. Thank you. You read really clearly. Thank you. And I sometimes speak a little fast, so you read it just the right pace. I always try to get everything quickly. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to say here is the following. Number one, the value of human dignity, I'm giving away the answer, spoiler alert, before we get there in 50 minutes, is ultimately the thread, that is the threshold, the guiding norm of how we think about economic policy in halacha, in Jewish law. And we're going to have some excerpts from the Gemara, the codes, and what they call, when I was in yeshiva, the Heintikers, the latest generation, as it were, of poskim. We have some excerpts here and there. So we'll trace it down historically from Bible to, just this, this latest century, in terms of getting at this in more specific detail with examples, basically. But the thread, if you have one takeaway from tonight's talk, the thread is human dignity as the arbiter of economic policymaking in Jewish law. That does not mean that the rabbis were unaware of economics per se, of degrees of what a tariff might do in terms of projections economically. The OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, the rabbis kind of did do these calculations, as it were. But ultimately, they went somewhere else besides pure economics. They didn't go to where, Adam Smith or Karl Marx went in terms of just thinking economics qua economics. They thought economics qua human dignity. That was their threshold for what the guiding norm, or grund norm in legal theory, if you want to use a technical term, would be as regards making policy. That's the guiding norm. Another thing to bear in mind is that because it comes from antiquity, Judaism, in terms of its halachic rubric, really comes from the idea of the ancient city-state. Judaism is not thinking of a post-industrial, federalist country like the United States. So we're thinking in terms of small little municipalities, whether, before the fall of the temple, small little Roman vassal state, or, kahillas operating in the Sephardi world, operating even today in Morocco. If you're a Jew, literally today, you have to go to the Bet Din in Marrakesh to have any kind of civil law procedure or personal status issue decided. So the Kehillah, or the independent, small, autonomous unit of government is what we're thinking of. But notwithstanding that, and that difference, I think the values that we're talking about here in terms of how human dignity gets played out practically, we're going to see it in just a minute, is something we should think about as a guiding norm. One thing we've lost, and a little editorial moment here, one thing we've lost in our culture today politically has been a common discourse, common language that we use, and then we fall left, right, or center. The language, the word democracy means something very, very different to, different groups of Americans. So I'm seeking here tonight to recapture a common discourse that comes right out of halachic values. And in that I go from Rabbi Soloveitchik and the Rav, who said any real Jewish philosophy should come from the matrix of Jewish law. So now let's start with a primary source. You can't get more primary than the Hebrew Bible, right? Than the Bible itself. This phrase, I only took a clause, the ratio, the first, just a piece of the pasuk. Just the first part of my discussion tonight is just this piece. Who wants to read it either in Hebrew or English? Then we'll go through it. This is the foundation of what we would now call protectionism, or the lack thereof in Jewish law. This piece of the pasuk, this clause, this beginning of the whole shir, as it were, this ratio of the whole shir, is just from this one biblical verse. There are others, by the way, but let's look at this one. Who wants to read? I'll read the Hebrew. Who wants to read the English and the Rashi piece that I've chosen? This from this clause of the pasuk. Anyone? I will read it. I will volunteer myself. So you shall not move back the boundary of your fellow, meaning don't move like to change land. Don't kind of encroach on your neighbor's land, as it were, right? Hasagas gvul is the term used traditionally in terms of this category of Jewish law. And Rashi says outside, there's something about what applies inside the land of Israel, outside the land of Israel. I'm not worried about that. For our purposes, we're chutz la'aretz. We're talking about American government right now. So outside the land of Israel, chutz la'aretz. When one encroaches on his neighbor's property by moving a field marker, right, real estate, this is economics, he transgresses lo tigzol, you shall not rob, right, lo tigzol. So it's really, if you're transgressing on if you're encroaching on someone's property, and we're about to see that means business market, as it were, then there's an issue of robbery, there's an ethical issue. It's not just an issue of trade policy per se, but it's a human values issue. And immediately this becomes taken up in the Torah Shabbal Peh, in the oral tradition, as the foundational principle, right? It's robbery, right? It's blatant in your face kind of a violent act, as it were. It's a violation. And by the way, Gzela has that implication. It's really more violent than even Kneva, Gzela. So this kind of robbery is a real encroachment on someone's property, is an affront to someone else's dignity. Remember, I'm not here to resolve all kinds of differences. I'm here to make an argument, as it were, and to build an argument through the whole of rabbinic literature in summary, as it were, by taking bits and pieces of each of its literatures. So, lo sigzol, you shall not rob. There's gazela involved if you encroach on hasagas gvul, right? There's robbery involved if you encroach on your fellow's property. And that is taken as the foundational element of what we would now call, let's say, protectionism in American economic law. So now there's really in one particular tractate, there's a whole long give and take, as it were, between Amoraim, between Talmudic teachers, around what actually constitutes this. And there are differences between the first two opinions that they become actually sort of foundational opinions that the codes later on have to take up. But for our purposes, I just want you to get a sense of the rabbis thinking about policy making and trade, just like we would today, protectionism, right? It's an irony that one of the coincidences of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in 2016, they kind of parted ways over the last 4 or 5 years. American politics became more heated. But in the beginning, they both were protectionists. They were anti-globalists. They may still be, actually. But they both were anti-globalists, which was a break with the center and certainly with the traditional Republican Party. For some with Obama's Democratic legacy as well, in terms of that part of the Democratic Party. So that idea of protectionism, of going against NAFTA, full disclosure, years ago, right out of school, I worked at Lehman Brothers for a year and I wrote speeches for Jim Robinson, who was at Lehman Brothers, and he was lobbying for NAFTA. So full disclosure, I came out of a free trade background. But this is what the Gemara says. Who wants to read the first piece? And I actually quoted it in order, just bits and pieces of the main Sugya and Hasaga school that I had the chance to go through and that I really base a lot of my work on, and most people do in Baba Basra. Who wants to just read, can read in the Aramaic or the English, it doesn't matter, but there are certain words I'm going to pick up in the Aramaic that you're going to find familiar from the Hebrew, they're going to resonate with you, like l'chayusi, for example, in the first clause. Speaks to, when I picked it up right away, and it's not easy Aramaic, but obviously l'chayusi resonates, right? Chayim, life, right? It's deeper than just an economic issue. Who wants to read what Rav Huna said? Anyone? Hebrew, Aramaic, English, whatever you want, doesn't matter. Rabbi Kurtz.
I'll go for it, following in Toby's footsteps.
Okay.
Amar Rav Huna, Hi bar mavota oki richya. So if someone who is living in a mavoi, in a communal alleyway, and he sets up shop, he sets up with a millstone, vasa bar mavoa chavre v'komaki gabe, and then his fellow mavoi member sets up shop with the same profession, the same type of millstone right next to him. Dinahu t'ma'aki v'lave, damrle kabasakdele lechayuse. He's allowed to tell him, you're not allowed to set up shop next to me because you're depriving me of my livelihood.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. Now, Mavu, an excellent translation, not from Sefaria, which is where I got this material from. So pardon the copying and pasting with the lack of gaps here and there. It's not easy to copy and paste Hebrew letters onto my keyboard. But nonetheless, a Mavui technically is an alleyway. Yes, that's true. But it's not just an alleyway. Much like you would have strips where you find a similar trade today of people who may sell the same thing. There are strip malls to this day in New Jersey where you just have a group of furniture shops, down the road or something like that, like in Paramus, I believe, if I remember correctly. And certainly there are places where you'll just find to this day in Midtown Manhattan, interior design textile stores in the East 50s. So a mavui doesn't just mean setting up shop in an alleyway, but it means an alleyway devoted to a certain trade, specifically, of a similar type usually. And so here we're talking about a real encroachment. If someone comes along, someone from another mavui and sets up shop, and could be a real competitor, let's presume similar industry, similar trade, both shoemakers, let's say. A new guy comes along and sets up to the old guy. It's, the halacha says, at least according to Rav Huna, this is debated. It doesn't get implemented quite this strictly, but nonetheless, there's certainly an important opinion, Rav Huna, that says, no, not so fast. Why? Because you're disrupting my livelihood. It's not an economic issue per se, just to drive home the point. It's an issue of the dignity of that individual, right? That older, and we're going to actually see it, maybe a more senior craftsperson, a senior artisan, that older person who's made his or her life in that shop and raised a family in that shop. And I'm being very specific when I choose my language. I'm not just being homiletic here. Someone who's really made a life there, somehow that their dignity, their livelihood, because there's books on it now in economics, the dignity of work. What is a quality job? The dignity of work. There's a dignity to work that might be encroached upon. I'm not yet getting into free trade, because certainly there are others like Rambam later on who say, let's leave it alone. You go to your store, and Hilchos Shchenim, laws of neighbors and neighboring businesses. There's leniencies on this, but there's an idea, a kernel that we should bear with us leaving tonight, that, competition has to be handled sensitively, especially to those more senior. It's just a whole other framework. I'm not saying it may be better or worse than the way we think about economics, but it's a Jewish way of looking at things, and we should take that into account. Okay, now we have a different opinion, and I underlined here the ishayach for a certain reason, because shayach means more than just pays the tax, which is the translation. Anyone want to read the next excerpt, which comes next, the next opinion, which is a little bit broader and a little bit easier than Rav Huna. Rav Huna, another Rav Huna, but a different one, son of Rabbi Yehoshua. Anyone want to read English or Aramaic? That doesn't matter.
I'll read English.
Thank you.
It is obvious to me that a resident of one town can prevent a resident from another town from establishing a similar business in the location of the first individual. But if he pays the tax of that first town, he cannot prevent him from doing business, what is it, there, as he too is considered a resident of the town. Sorry.
Excellent, thank you. It was very clear, it was fine. So I underlined the E shayach, the chagra, right? And if he isn't, now shayach doesn't mean just he pays the tax. Shaychus, anyone who knows a little Yiddish or shaychut in Hebrew, means belonging or involved with, right? It means you're attached to something, literally. So if someone's involved with the community and paying a tax, a local tax, that's actually the word. And I checked with my Jastro, my Talmudic dictionary, just to make sure I really got what karga really meant. And it really does mean a local tax. It's a mas. Mas means tax. It's really a local poll tax. So someone who is involved, and that's literally the better translation. And if someone is involved with paying the local tax, then they're considered a resident of the town, and they can open up a shop next door. So what are they talking about? Again, we're talking the language of values, not sheer economic projections. So that if someone really is involved with the life of the town, of the municipality, is doing their job as a citizen, you know, and is paying their taxes and taking part in the civic life, at least through the minimal action of tax paying in the life of the city, then how can you say no? They're involved with the city. So again, we're speaking your language still. It's a different lens, but through which to look at human dignity, but because it throws the lens onto what are the qualifications you have to get over the hurdle of Hasagas Gvul in a way, or at least to redefine it in some way, and to where should that Gvul, where should that border be in terms of what does it mean to encroach on someone else's property, in this case their business and their economic stability. But we're going from chayusi, from someone's livelihood. On the one side, you have to respect the seniority of someone's livelihood if he's there before you. But you also, but if you want to make that leap and reach that point, then you have to be involved with the life of the town, with the civic life of the town. By the way, that's a really important point in American political science too, because one of the other issues besides economics, but it speaks to economics and the divisiveness of American society right now that lots of scholars are writing about. There's a guy at Harvard, Putnam, P-U-T-N-A-M, wrote a famous book called Bowling Alone. And he traced over the last 20 or 30 years, since the 90s, so it's a long time now, since the Clinton era, that Americans have become less volunteeristic. That's impacted the rest of our lives. So, you know, my mother is a lifelong member of Hadassah. That seems like you know, and she's still living in well, thank God, but it seems like another era to me, you know? So this idea of civic engagement, of civic involvement has eroded in this country. That's definitely documented all the way through. I can tell you as a college professor, we try to get our students to do a certain amount of hours in the community beyond our campus ivory towers before they graduate, because the campus is located nearby a disadvantaged community, mentoring in a public school, something like that. But it's really something new, whereas lots of Americans did that kind of thing naturally, or were sort of civic minded. Think of American attendance at houses of worship across denomination. It was once a thing. And now it's only for the most observant in any community, any faith community. So halacha is reminding us of the place of values, even in economic policymaking. There's chayusi, my livelihood, my dignity. And then there's my shaychus, literally, my connection, my involvement with my community. These values matter, and they can provide us with new words like civic engagement, or human dignity, or, you know, they can provide us with new words with which to think about economics. And then we can plug in the numbers and make projections and tweak the policy. But we're coming up with new language. You see, we are going to solve all the problems of America tonight. I wasn't kidding. Okay, now we have something that seems to go against the whole notion of Hasagas Gvul in a way, because the little machlokus, maybe it's not so little, it's a big machlokus, you know, according to many, between Rav Huna and Rav Huna B'rei Rav Yehoshua, was about, you know, what to do in an alleyway when you're setting up a similar kind of business. Can you or can you not? And what are the conditions for such? Now we have what looks like an exception to the rule. And it's pretty famous, but yet it also speaks to dignity, but in a way that's not so obvious. Who wants to read here, English or Hebrew? It's a little bit easier in the Hebrew, actually, in the Aramaic. It's actually Hebrew, but it's fine in the English. Doesn't really matter. But it's from the same sugya, which is what's interesting. That Ravina Ravashi, when putting together the Gemara, had put this in there. That's really interesting to think that this voice is in there, which kind of comes out and sort of threw me as I went through the sugya, because it's just an exceptional case. It's not about mavu. It's not about business strips or strip malls. Who wants to read the English here? Where Rav Yosef said.
I'll read it.
Okay.
Rav Yosef said, and Rav Huna, who said that a resident of an alleyway can prevent another from setting up an additional mill, concedes with regard to those who teach children that one cannot prevent him from working. As the master said, Ezra instituted an ordinance for the Jewish people requiring that they establish one teacher alongside another teacher to raise the standard of teaching. The Gemara challenges, and let us be concerned lest the teachers will thereby come to be negligent. Rav Yosef said to the sage who raised this objection, jealousy among teachers increases wisdom.
Thank you. So if I open up a cheder and Rabbi Kurtz or Rabbi Cohen open up a cheder or a yeshiva katana, a day school next to my day school, there's no issue. We can let's say these are for-profit enterprises. This is old school. This is a shtetl, pre-war shtetl. We're not talking about 501c3 nonprofits with boards. We're talking about a teacher owning the school, collecting tuition payments from the parents once a week. And there's no worrying about being in a mavui full of yeshiva katanas. There's no worry about a street full of day schools, one next to the other. Why? Because kinas sofrim, it's a famous principle, the jealousy of these teachers, tarbe chochma, multiplies wisdom, right? What's going on here? How could we have nothing regarding chinuch habanim? And by the way, I mean, I'm sure you know, but there's all sorts of legislation regarding public school system, right? We have a takana. It's kind of a form of tikkun olam to some degree. We have a takana, that there should be preschools for every kid who wants, right? Fathers weren't teaching their children, and so send the kid off to preschool. Yeshua ben Gamla set this up. There's a big takana on this, a big meaning and amendment to the law, as it were, for the sake of social. What Amy Gutman, president of the University of Pennsylvania, is a great political theorist, says: social reproduction, to reproduce society in a civil manner. So education is a big deal. So when it comes to education, throw out this worry about about the details of how we might or might not violate Hasaga school, and set up the schools wherever you want. The more the merrier. Why? And how does what's going on with human dignity here? I've just spent 35 minutes talking about human dignity. My whole argument seems out the window. Or does it? Obviously it doesn't. It's a rhetorical question. But really, how what's the resolution, as it were, to the difficulty presented by this piece of the Gemara in an otherwise pretty consistent discussion about commercial encroachment on different kinds of businesses? Like mills, there's discussions in this piece of Gemara on cosmetic salesmen, on peddlers. There's all kinds of tradesmen covered in this Gemara. Bloodletters are in there. But what's going on with owners of schools and educators? How come schools get are they getting a patur, an exemption? What's going on here? Or not? Or is somehow dignity still in play here? I see someone, I guess someone just wrote that. It's a great line.
Question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
What about charter schools? I mean, that's a perfect example of what's going on with competition.
Right. So Jewish law, I guess, if you really want to plug it in, might say the more the merrier, the more school choice, the better. Remember, we're not thinking like, only Americans with narrow blinders on about, American public policy discourse. We're looking at things now with new norms. Human dignity, for example, is the norm on one level, respect for people's livelihoods another, and now there's something else going on here. So there is dignity being preserved here. There is not any kind of irresolvable difficulty with this piece juxtaposed in the middle of what is otherwise a commercially focused subject. Because we're still dealing with a form of business. Nonprofits are still private corporations. Shuls and yeshivas have to survive, and universities have to survive too, as we all know during this pandemic. So we're still dealing with businesses, as it were, even if they're for the public interest. And so what Chazal here, I suggest, is saying is that there's a higher level of dignity at work when it comes to education. And you could probably put in other values in here as well, but I'm just taking education because that's what's in the sugya. And the dignity of our society, as well as the dignity of individual educational institutions, is preserved, in this case, through competition. It's one thing when it's an elderly shopkeeper whose livelihood might be threatened. It's another thing when you have a school, an institution of that nature, and its dignity has to be preserved by the quality of what it does in a way that is different than a craftsman. In its pedagogy, meaning the way it teaches, in its curriculum, in its success with its students. You just told me you had last night a great evening. You're alumni of your shul, of your community, and I'm sure of local day schools around it. So the idea of dignity here is institutional. And I think the dignity of an institution is something to bear in mind as well when we think of politics in this country. What does that mean? I'm not saying it in a partisan way, I'm really not. But what does it mean? And every institution has to think about this for itself. Maybe in its strategic planning sessions, add on another box besides, the SWOT analysis that many do. What is it? Opportunities and threats and, I teach this in public administration when you do these strategic plans. But what you really have to do is think about what preserves, in addition to SWOT, put in a D, the dignity of the institution. And so Chazal here is saying, just for a second, take a step back as we think about individual businesses, and let's think about what does it mean to preserve an institution founded in the public interest, which is different than an institution by a craftsperson or even a corporation. Just so take that as something to think about as a variable, because all we're doing tonight is setting out there a table, as it were, a mappa, as it were, of language that we can use, new norms and thresholds we can use for the thinking through of policy in a way that gets us past the partisanship of today in America. That was my promise to you. Okay, now let's go a little further. And we have just one piece of the Gemara that's often not cited, but I just thought it was a very nice piece because it really brought home the dignity issue. Who wants to read this? And then we're going to jump right to the concluding pieces of this source sheet. I think we will make our way through most of it. Who just wants to read about the wool sellers?
Okay, I'll read it.
Thank you.
The Gemara further relates, there were these wool sellers who brought wool to the city of Pumnahara. The townsfolk came and prevented them from selling it. The two parties came before Rav Kahana for a ruling. Rav Kahana said to them, the halacha is that they may prevent you from selling your wares. The wool sellers said to him, we have debts to collect in the city, and we must sell our wares in the meantime to sustain ourselves until we are paid. Rav Kahana said to them, go and sell the amount needed to sustain yourselves until you have collected your debts, and then leave.
So sustenance here, basic needs, you can have a waiver, as it were, in order to have an exception so something can get done so people can collect their debt and then get out. So you keep the rule in place, you have an exception, and you move on, again, to prevent, to protect, in this case, the dignity of those who needed their debts collected. There's something about that, they're standing professionally and just they have a business to run. So what we're seeing here as well, besides the theme of human dignity, which I keep repeating, is something I'm repeating much less, which is that halacha is not fixated ideologically on a straight line when it comes to economic policy. It is fixated ideologically on the values we're talking about, the norms of either institutional or individual dignity, shopkeeper, institutions, thinking about what each business, as it were, needs to maintain its social standing and its own sense of self as an institution. But aside from that, there's no fixed ideology. You may need a regulation one day, that's pretty stringent. Maybe you'll drop it the next day. Maybe you need an exception now and then, a waiver of some kind. Like in real estate, there are waivers and variances given out all the time for building projects. Sometimes justified, sometimes not, but that's beside the point. What's important to understand is that let's not get fixed on, and the blurb that Rabbi Kurtz put out on the about this, on orthodoxy, smaller one, an orthodoxy regarding economic policy. There's nothing fixed except what it means to be human. Rav Soloveitchik could say Judaism it's a humanistic tradition centered on how can we realize our potential, right? We are partners where we have a shutfus, we have a partnership with God in finishing the job of history, right? And so how can we realize the best of our humanity? The halacha is as much here for us as it is for us to serve Hashem with as Obdei Hashem, as servants of God. So those are the threshold values. In terms of the details of regulation of protectionism or trade, that depends on the moment. That's not bound by ideology. It's a very different way of thinking than coming from a society like ours, where we think in terms of left and right. It's about human values and then what's best at the moment. It may mean dropping a regulation and deregulating, and it may mean anteing up here and there, depending on the situation. And we're going to now see something, an example I like to use when talking about dignity in terms of thinking about halacha, because it's, first of all, it's a halacha that usually causes a little bit of discomfort, and that's always good to be a little uncomfortable. And second of all, it's really interesting because of its activities, if we can get past its effrontery towards us as Americans today. So it actually comes out of a piece of Chumash. And it's a take on what is Dei Machsora. What does it mean to give enough to help sustain someone in a time of need? And so let's see, and it's actually codified in Shulchan Aruch. This is actually law. This is not homiletics. This is not me conjecturing. Now what I'm about to show you is straight up law. And think about it for a second, because it's about social services, right? Social service delivery. What does the kuppah, meaning in Jewish law, the kuppah, just like I guess Kupat Cholim in Israel today, but the Kupat generally would mean the assistance fund, as it were, the tamchui, the food assistance fund, the soup kitchen. What would they have to do in Jewish law to sustain, a local person who's had a hard time economically? And I'm sure your shul, like my shul and others, have benevolent funds that they collect at all the major holidays. So this is something to think about. No one, I don't know if can really meet this criteria, but the value it talks about is really important for us to become sensitized to. So who would like to read Kama Nosnim La'ani? How much are we supposed to give to a poor man to sustain him if he was once wealthy? This is the question the Shulchan Aruch is about to answer for us. And it's raised in Chumash itself. Who would like to read this paragraph? Anyone? It's a tough piece of Shulchan Aruch to digest. And I translated it literally, word for word, pretty much. Anyone want to read it out loud?
Want me to read again?
Why not? Why not?
How much is to be given to a poor man, sufficient for his need in that which he wanteth? Thus, if he is hungry, he should be fed. If he needs clothing, he should be clothed. If he lacks household utensils, they should be purchased for him. And even if he had been accustomed before he was impoverished to ride on horseback with a slave running before him, he should be furnished with a horse and a slave. And so each and every one should be supplied with what he needs.
By the way, the Eved, just to be politically, on top of things, really means servant in this case. We're not talking about a slave in the sense of American history. Right. We're just talking about a servant. But we're a guy with a limo who lost his limo, who should be given a limo for, Aaron Levine, by the way, a great late economist and posek in Jewish civil law. Aaron Levine wrote that this only should be for a certain period of time. I think in a book put out by the Orthodox Forum on Jewish business ethics years ago, Aaron Levine wrote maybe like a 6-month window so that the person and the community in which he finds himself can adjust to his newfound social and economic status based on a loss of income. So we can put a time cap on this. But nonetheless, even if it's for 6 months, imagine your synagogue's benevolent fund supporting, let's say, a hedge fund person lost, I'm thinking of Connecticut, Greenwich. I have some familiarity with these parts, having been at Lehman Brothers for a year as a kid, lost a couple $100 million. What do? No one's saying a couple $100 million, but the limo, the driver, that's the white horse, right? Okay. So got to have that. At least for 6 months, if I'm going by Rabbi Levine's take on this.
That last part bothers me. That last part really bothers me.
But good.
You should be furnished with a slave and a horse. I mean, come on, give me a break.
Right. So chauffeur, and let's translate that. What he really means is chauffeur and driver. So chauffeur and driver is someone who lost it and once had it. That's what we're talking about here in modern terms. So imagine that. But what is really going on here? Let's take away the. No, I don't know if any community ever actually did this. I didn't do the research to see, if there was anecdotal evidence of implementation of this, but the principle holds in Shulchan Aruch. It's there. You can look it up tonight in your shul's library. It's right there. So what is the halacha saying here? I mean, Rashi quotes it in the Chumash, by the way, in the pasuk I put in there in the reference. It comes out of the Chumash. It's just codified by Shulchan Aruch. It's not a chiddush. It's not a new idea.
It's
That came
somehow,
out in the hundreds.
it's somehow to keep his dignity.
That's what it is. It's a psychological sensitivity. That's really what's going on. Give someone at least the accoutrements. And by the way, this is not in the Meforshim, I'm conjecturing here. We're talking about is the public look of what this person does. They're not talking about home. They are talking about utensils and stuff. But really the focus, the chauffeur in limo is what you get seen in publicly, right? When you go to shop or drop your kids off at school or go to work. So it's the public perception of the former usher, the former rich person who's now the ani of this piece of, I see a comment that the Syrian community actually does this. Yeah, and it's something, I don't know yes or no, but if so, it's nice to know it's implemented, that someone's following this halacha strictly. So
Well, maybe it's about the person's dignity in front of his own children too.
could be.
You know, how do you explain, the hardest thing is to explain to your children that you can't afford what you used to be able to afford.
Right. So there's a sensitivity issue. But so what the halacha is doing, we've gone now from a piece of chumash, which is just kind of the source of the rubric, Hasaga school, it's the source, but it talks about the violation of someone's livelihood or their property. It gives us that hanger to, or that hook to hang ourselves well on. I shouldn't say hang on, but hang ourselves positively on, hang the halachas on. Then we go through 4 little pieces of a sugya in the Gemara that play this out in different ways, and with the exception of the school. And now we're in codes, the late medieval period, as it were, in Jewish law anyway. And we're already seeing how this idea of dignity is really the arbiter of lawmaking for any Jewish community. And it's a value we can take with us into our civic lives as well. So again, it gets us past the partisanship. No one's saying break the bank for the newfound ani, for the newfound poor person. The halacha wouldn't say that. No one's saying forget about all kinds of projections regarding tax revenue when you choose a mas, a tax for a community. But we are saying don't forget human values. It's not just Adam Smith or Karl Marx. It's not just economics per se. Rabbi Kurtz.
So turning to other major issues in America today that I think are relevant to this discussion, do you think these sources or other sources that are relevant address issues of trust busting? We're dealing with Amazon, Google, Disney, how Disney Plus has now, in the media agency, they have everything now, Marvel, National Geographic. Does any sources inform us on whether there should be regulation to break down these major companies?
So let's start with a source that I have actually on this page, the bottom, Rabbi Chaim or Howard Jachter, who's a great sort of operating in the centrist Orthodox world. He's known as, I guess, the Eruv King. When I was rabbi of a shul, the one Rabbi Kurtz visited a few years ago, I once called him. We didn't get to the point where we were thinking of an Eruv at some point. So, but he's also a tremendous posek with a tremendous breadth of knowledge from Sephardic to the Ashkenazi rabbinic literature.
He came to check our Eruv recently.
Oh, did he? Okay, he's the guy. So 21 years ago, just when the internet was exploding, before social media came out, Facebook's 2006, but Google's already around in 2000, he was prescient in this regard. And we can use his quote at the bottom as a springboard to answer Rabbi Kurtz's question, because he begins to touch at the edges of what Rabbi Kurtz is now addressing, because now we're in the heart of what Rabbi Jachter was looking at 21 years ago. So let's just look at the second to last paragraph. He said, it should be noted that changing patterns in the geography of business impact halachic discussions of competition. Many businesses today do not cater exclusively to their local neighborhoods, by meaning not everything's a mavui anymore. I mean, even when I was a kid, there were still streets where you would find, like furniture stores, or like I said, interior decorating stores. But now we have the internet. It's endless real estate. I can find anything, anywhere, anytime. There's no concentrated geographic mavui or alleyway for a similar type of trade. And then he quotes something, from the Tel Aviv Rabbanut, which sort of emphasized that point. I'm just going to jump to the last 3 lines because we're running out of time. Following this reasoning, geographic location would not limit stores that conduct much of their business through the World Wide Web. Thus, each business must be individually evaluated based on contemporary business conditions to determine if the rules of Hasagas Gvul apply to it. It's not very informative, but he does raise the issue. The question is out there. So there are different ways of looking at it. I know that Rabbi Jachter in this article said, for example, in a downtown business district like a Times Square or a Herald Square in Manhattan, where you might have lots of clothing stores. You walk down 34th Street, discount clothing stores. You've got the Gap and Banana Republic and American Eagle and all these other stores that you wouldn't have to have, he says, such hasagas of wool, because that kind of concentration of global economy is bringing tourists in from all over to that strip. It's helping everyone. So it tweaks hasagas of wool in a way that if you look, we don't have time to go into it, Moshe Feinstein above is actually very concerned with the seniority of who was there first, but globalization might be tweaking that, because even in physical locations like the Herald Square, let alone the web, everyone's getting business, so it's helpful to everyone to maybe have a less regulated environment. That's a real question. I've opened up a little bit of a hornet's nest there, because it's a real issue about how do you regulate the internet, because there we can get into hezek re'iyah, right? I wasn't prepared for that. I'm just coming to my head as I speak, the idea of privacy issues in the Gemara, which is what Facebook, I made Google discount men's shirts one day, and the next day on my Facebook feed, I've got 10 ads for discounted men's shirts. So clearly someone's doing something with my
For sure.
search history. Did you have a question, ma'am? I'm sorry.
No, well, I could just say, I was thinking in 47th Street in Manhattan, the
Right.
Diamond District,
Right.
you have 3-4 streets, couple of blocks long. Each store sells the same merchandise, and they're all Jews. Well, they were at one time. I haven't been there in the last few years.
Right. But the idea is that, I haven't looked at that case. It's a great case. I didn't think of it. But I would imagine I would plug in Rabbi Jachter's 2000 article and say that because it's bringing business to the strip, and the strip, by the way, is organized. I know this from urban policy as a business improvement district, as a strip
Yes.
to attract tourism to the district, that they have all kinds of, where they work together, the owners, on marketing for the street, so that I would imagine if it's good for everybody, then no one has to worry about hasagas gvul. That's I think I'm pretty safe in saying or suggesting Rabbi Jachter could go that way. If not for him, I don't want to put words in his mouth. I think that would be a fair argument to make in a Beis Din, let's say, if this was an issue.
Mhm.
Rabbi Unger,
Yes.
so question for you. The basis for individual dignity is the notion that we're all created b'tselem Elohim, and therefore there is a notion that regardless of whether or not I live up to the aspirations of what I should be, there is a core human dignity that is inherent in me and that you are responsible to respect. What is the basis for a notion of any institutional dignity that you've referred to?
Okay, so this is not in the notes, and I toyed with putting this on the source sheet, but I wanted to do just an hour, and I think my timing was okay on that. We didn't get to my end but we got to Rabbi Jachter's. That's more important. There is a whole theory of what is a corporation in Choshen Mishpat, in Jewish civil law. We assume a corporation. This will offend some, but okay, I'll leave you on a note of discomfort. That's okay for a seminar, right? We believe that a corporation is a separate person. Anyone who set up an LLC, right? I have one for consulting purposes. It's a separate business, right? That way I'm somehow inured from any problem. Michael Brody writes about this quite a bit, by the way. And he's a great guy in terms of Jewish civil law and a great thinker in terms of secular and Jewish law. But there's another theory based actually largely on pretty contemporary poskim, contemporary Jewish judges actually, that the corporation is actually a partnership. It's a shutfus, it's a partnership of some kind. It's a human partnership and is actually not a separate person in Jewish law. There's a whole strand of that in Jewish civil law, of that theory of the corporation as not a separate person from its owners, but actually as an extension of the persons who own it. So Abe Unger's consulting business is Abe Unger. I'm open to all liability, as it were, no matter what. And I'm socially, and to answer your question, I'm socially responsible because of that. There's a degree of altruism involved in that. So for example, one of the great examples of this, which the late great Rabbi Dr. Walter Wurzburger used to write about, because he knew them, was the Feuerstein family in Malden Mills, the great Orthodox-owned Massachusetts clothing company. And when they lost their company, basically because of deindustrialization, they made a point, based on Jewish values, under the guidance of their Rav, Rabbi Wurzburger, I believe, to retrain their workers for a new technological age in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so that idea of corporate social responsibility doesn't come from a left-wing or a right-wing place, which I'm trying to get away from in this talk, in this year, but from a place of, in this case, I'm responsible for the corporation because I own it. It's an extension of who I am. Me and my partners are the corporation It's not a distinct legal entity. That's not the only strand in Jewish law. There are those who differ, to be fair, but there's a really strong set of poskim who make that case very powerfully, pretty recently, within the last couple of decades or 100 or so years, whatever it might be. So I would answer your question that way. What I've tried to do this evening is get away from the discourse we're used to in American life and bring in a set of values-driven terms and their origins to come up with new ways of thinking about policy making in America that can help bring us together a little bit more in a divided republic, as it were. American democracy can be therefore a little bit more, a little bit more safe, as it were, meaning we can preserve it more wholly, no matter where we're coming from ideologically in the American context. And Jewish values really do speak to this. These have been halachic sources. I'm not, speaking drusha. I'm not speaking only homiletically. These are real sources that you can plug in. And if we were involved in writing a tshuva, I've been involved in writing one tshuva, like one serious tshuva that was applied and that was actually used in a civil matter. These ideas can be plugged in. They're serious and real, and I would urge us to use them. We have, 1 minute left. Any final questions or thoughts? I'm happy to stay on 2 or 3 minutes if anyone has any comments or thoughts or questions. I'm hoping the takeaways are clear. I'm sorry, go ahead, yes. Anyone? Okay. So let me then close out with just 1 or 2 lines. This is actually from the book that I wrote on this issue. I'm trying to continue with the theory in the beginning, the model I started out with, and then wrap it up neatly for you as well. Even with the discomfort we had in that piece of Shulchan Aruch, which bears thinking about, which we should walk away really thinking about. The implications for a Jewish theological perspective on current public debates on global trade, because we're talking about protectionism here, Hasagas Gvul, and the issues therein, bring to bear a moral vision in clarion terms. And then I'll just jump to the very end. The newcomer to an industry, those are the earlier pieces, whether it's in the same mavui or from a different town, regardless, the newcomer to an industry must look elsewhere to develop his business. If it becomes apparent he will not encroach too strongly on extant competitors. That's the essence of Hasagas Gvul. The municipality calculates the cost to human dignity. There's a cost involved there. Anyone involved in investment knows that ESG, environmental, social, and governance criteria, are now part of some wealth managers' investment criteria, along with whether or not a treasury bill gets a AAA rating, right? Everyone knows that there's now social criteria in place that are being used more and more. And by the way, it's for the traditional community as well. There's Catholic criteria. Morgan Stanley has criteria. If you're Jewish, Catholic, etc. It's not just for, sort of, if you were the left, as it were, that there are social issues bubbling up in every cluster of our society that people are now thinking about more and more. So the municipality, meaning the halachically driven municipality, us coming to our civic lives with Jewish values in mind, calculates the cost to human dignity, not just the cost economically, but we also take into account the cost to human dignity of an overbearing competition that may deny a longtime business person his or her sense of personal value within the social fabric. So I'm hoping that I drove home the point clearly enough, and even the moments that we have to think about and struggle with help us clarify how Jewish values, based on halachic sources, can speak to the issues present in our civic lives today. And I thank you.
Yasher Koach,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much for your time,
Thank
Rabbi
you.
Unger. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank
All
you
right.
very much. Have a good night.
We'll send you the recording. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Unger.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
interesting.